Hello everyone, welcome back to another video, and today we're going to be talking about the pseudocapacitor. So if you saw my previous video about the EDLC ultracapacitor, you'll be ready to watch this one, but if you haven't seen that, I highly recommend going and clicking on that video because I'll be talking about some things that I referred to in that previous video, and if you haven't seen it, you may be a little bit confused. So I'll link that in the description so you can watch it there. Alright, so anyway, pseudocapacitors. So if you watch the EDLC video, you'll know that the electrochemical double layer capacitor, it charges electrostatically, right? It's electrostatic. Now, sometimes this is also called non-Faradaic, but essentially what this means is that we have the two electrodes, right? And let's say in here is our, that's our electrolyte layer, right? There's not going to be any protons and stuff that, and not neutrons, protons and electrons crossing and things. It's all going to stay on its side. They're separated, really. There's not going to be anything that is crossing. There's no chemical reactions occurring. So that's why it's electrostatic. And that's how almost all capacitors is. I mean, it's part of what makes a capacitor a capacitor. But what if you had a fake capacitor or a pseudocapacitor? Well, then it wouldn't really charge electrostatically. So that's why a pseudocapacitors charge Faradaically. And that means that there's chemical reactions going on between electrodes. So you could also say they charge electrochemically. They're electrochemical. And basically, if you know anything about batteries, like let's say you've studied lithium-ion batteries, you'll know that those type of batteries are electrochemical because there's charges that are crossing through the membranes. And that's essentially the whole idea behind the pseudocapacitor, is that if you think about it, there's going to be an electrode here, but they're going to be able to cross. They're going to be able to go to different electrodes and stuff. It's not just going to be those two double layers like we had on the EDLC, or the electrochemical double layer capacitor. And that's why it's called a pseudocapacitor, because it's not really a real capacitor. It's sort of a pseudo one. So now why would we want to do this? Like, what benefit would this actually have? Well, if you refer back to our previous video, we were talking about how one of the things that sort of holds ultracapacitors back is the fact that they don't have high energy density. So compared to an EDLC, the energy density for an EDLC is actually less than it would be for a pseudocapacitor. And that is really important if we're talking about trying to replace batteries. Because if we want to replace batteries, we want to have high energy density. So those are greater than the EDLC. In terms of energy density, and they're also greater in terms of capacitance. Yeah, so they're higher in both categories, and this makes them extremely beneficial because we were talking about how the reason that they sort of can't replace batteries is because they need higher energy density, and they need to be able to store more charge per given unit of volume or area or anything like that. So yeah, that's what makes them better in many ways, but there are also some drawbacks, and I'm going to talk about some of those here. So basically, for pseudocapacitors, there's really two main types of electrodes that are used. And if you refer back to the last video, we said that electrodes, those were the two things that were positive or negatively charged on the sides of the capacitor. So one electrode type is a conducting polymer. And this has some benefits. The conducting polymer, it has a high capacitance, and it has high conductivity. So obviously this is a good thing. But what's the drawback of this one? Well, this is bad after many cycles. So what happens is this one, it has to do with the N-doped polymers, but you can look into that if you want to. Essentially, really all you need to know is that after many cycles of using a conducting polymer electrode, it's really not going to be all that efficient anymore. It's going to have issues with charging. So it's one of the main issues, and one thing that is being researched right now is the manufacturing techniques that may make it easier to make it more efficient after many cycles. Because as we said, that's really one of the main benefits of capacitors, is that it's able to have all these cycles that a battery would normally not be able to have. But there is another type, and this is called metal oxides. And once again, these have high capacitance, and they also have high conductivity. And another thing that's special about these is these have a low ESR, and you may not know what ESR is because it's a pretty it's really only used in capacitors and some other battery type things. But essentially, it's a very simple concept. All it means is the total resistance in the capacitor. It's like if you added up all the little resistances, and I'm not talking about resistors that are added in. I'm talking about the intrinsic resistance in the electrodes themselves, because everything has some form of electrical resistance. So the electrodes themselves are going to have ESR, or electrical resistance within itself, the intrinsic resistance. So with metal oxides, it has the lowest of any of the electrodes, including the activated carbons we talked about in the last video, which are, I'm not sure if we exactly refer to activated carbons, but those are the electrodes that are normally used on an EDLC. But with metal oxides, you're getting a higher capacitance, higher conductivity, and a lower ESR than conducting polymers or activated carbons. So what's the downside of this one? High cost. These are very, very expensive. That's the big issue with metal oxides. Currently, it's costing too much money to manufacture them. So right now, we're just not able to manufacture them at scale to where a way they would be cost effective. So once again, with both of these, conducting polymers, they're working on making sure manufacturing is better to improve cycle life, and metal oxides, they're trying to get that cost down so that it can be more widespread. But those are the main two electrodes that are used on pseudocapacitors, and I hope you learned a bit about how a pseudocapacitor works and some of the advancements and things that are being done in the field right now. So thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.